Hello, in this video we'll be talking about gross domestic product, or GDP. So gross domestic product is the measure of all goods and services produced in a country in 1 year. So domestic means in a particular country, gross is total, and product refers to everything that's been produced. GDP is a measure of total output, and it's going to be a monetary value. So we're going to convert this into a dollar value rather than a quantity. It's all goods and services produced within a country's borders. It includes things that we sell to other countries, to other people. We subtract stuff that we purchase from other countries. It's meant to represent the total production in a particular nation in 1 year. So for instance, Toyota is a Japanese car company, but if they have a plant in Ohio, then it would count as US GDP. It's going to represent the monetary value of aggregate output. So we're going to convert it to a dollar value. This could be real value or nominal. We could be using current year prices, or we could be adjusting for inflation and using real prices. We can use the expenditures approach, which looks at the value of total produced goods and services, or the income approach, which is the value of the total income earned on the production of goods and services. This graphic here represents the circular flow of the economy. This shows how money and resources flow back and forth between households and firms. Because of this, whether we're using the expenditure approach or the income approach, we should get similar results. We can see on this outer circle here that money is flowing between households and firms. Firms hire households, give them wages, interest, profit, rent. So firms are providing money to households. The households then use that money to purchase goods and services from the companies. So money flows from firms to households, back to firms, back to households. In this inner circle, we see the flow of goods and services, resources in our economy. Households provide the factors of production to the firms. So they provide labor, capital, natural resources. They provide all of these resources so firms can produce things. Then firms then take what they produce and they give it to the households. So we have resources flowing from households to firms, turning into products, going back to the households. So if we're talking about the expenditure approach, we're looking at what's being spent on all of our consumer goods and services, right? Personal consumption, the money flowing from households to firms. So the top portion here would be our expenditures approach. If we're looking at the income approach of GDP, that's going to be the bottom half of this graph, right? Our income approach. We're looking at the money flowing from firms to households. So both of these things should be similar because of this circular flow. Money and resources are flowing back and forth between these two entities. We want to avoid double counting. We want to make sure that we're counting things only one time so that the total value of our GDP is only representing the actual value of what was produced. Many goods are actually purchased and then used to produce other goods. If we counted everything that was sold, then sometimes things would be counted more than once. For instance, if I own a bakery and I need to purchase sugar, if we count the value of the sugar when I purchase it from the sugar mill, and then we count the value of the cookies that I sell, we're actually double counting the value of the sugar, because the price that I'm selling the cookies for includes the cost of that sugar. So an intermediate good is something that's used in the production of other goods and services. It's purchased between firms. It's going to be further transformed before it's sold to the final user. This could be bread purchased by a sandwich shop, potatoes sold to a potato chip factory, anything that's being transferred between one business to another. A final good, however, is something that's purchased by the final user. So when I buy the sandwich from the sandwich shop, that's a final good. I buy a bag of potato chips, that's a final good. If I purchase potatoes at the grocery store for my own personal consumption, that would be a final good. Whereas if the potatoes are sold to a chip factory, it's an intermediate good. So it's not only about what the item is, but about who is using it. Will it be transformed again and resold, or is it being purchased by the final user? We are only going to be counting things in the year that they're produced, not in the year that it's sold. So the value of potatoes is going to be counted in the year that the potatoes are grown. If the potatoes are picked in December, but they're not sold until January, we would actually count the value of those potatoes in the GDP of the prior year, in the December year, not the January year. The value added method could potentially count intermediate goods as well, and only includes the extra value added to a good or a service at each step in the production process, rather than counting only the final value. So if we were going to look at the sandwich when I purchased it, maybe I paid $10 for that sandwich, but in the value added method, we may only add $3 when I purchase it at the final step, because we've already included the price of the bread and the meat and the other things as they were purchased along the way in the process. Either way, whether you're doing final good method or value added method, should come up with the same value. For purposes of this class, we're going to actually do some calculations using the final good method. There are some things that are excluded from GDP, so it doesn't represent the value of all goods and services sold or traded or transacted in a particular year. It just represents the value of everything that was produced in that year. We're going to exclude any purely financial transactions. So if it's money moving from one place to another, we're not going to count it. This includes many types of investment in the stock market, any sort of financial investments are not included in GDP. Public transfer payments, this is when the government collects taxes and then sends money out to households. It could be financial aid, it could be housing subsidies. Anytime the government is sending money to people, that's not counted in GDP because it's not something that's being produced. Private transfer payments also don't count. So if I give $10 to my mom, that's a purely financial transaction. We're not going to count that in GDP. Buying and selling stocks. This does play a really big role in the economy. We will talk about the stock market in a later chapter, but it's not something that we're counting in GDP because the value of stocks, the value of those investments, is not based on what's actually being produced. Some of it is speculative into the future about what we think future values of those companies will be, but it is just a purely financial transaction. Used goods are also excluded from GDP. They were already previously counted when they were produced. So if you purchased a used textbook for one of your classes, it was counted in GDP the first year that it was produced and sold. If it is then resold 5 or 10 or 20 times to other students, it doesn't count in GDP every single time. It only counts that one time. Household production is also not counted in GDP. So if you cook for yourself at home, the value of that service that you provided for yourself is not in GDP. If you pay somebody instead to cook dinner for you, then the value of that service is counted in GDP. If you stay home and watch your children, the value of that service is not counted in GDP. If instead your kids go to daycare or preschool, they're in elementary school, high school, the value of those services are counted in GDP. When we're comparing GDP, especially over long periods of time, it's really important to think about how the used goods and household production, even financial transactions, how those things are affecting the economy. You could be comparing years where there's a large number of stay-at-home parents versus another year where every kid is in daycare. In that case, GDP is going to look vastly different, even if the quality or level of services is relatively similar. First, we're going to be looking at the expenditure approach. this is the approach we're going to look at the most in depth and the one that we'll be using throughout the semester. We're going to continue using these ideas when we talk about aggregate expenditures model, as well as aggregate supply and demand. So in the expenditure approach, we're going to be looking at 4 categories: consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. We're going to be looking at all production of new goods and services during the year, even if it was not sold to consumers that year. Consumption, or C, is going to be the largest component of GDP. This is going to include things like durable goods, long-lasting goods that are consumed over time. You could think about like a furniture, a couch, refrigerator, computer, something that's used for a long period of time. Generally 3 years or more. We're going to also have non-durable goods. These are things that are consumed quickly or usable for only a short period of time. Think of fresh vegetables or gasoline, shampoo. If you buy vegetables, they might last a week, a couple weeks. You could freeze them, maybe they'll last 6 months or a year. But they're not going to be good indefinitely. Same with gasoline. If gas is really cheap, you can go get a barrel, fill it up with gasoline, store it at your house, but it's not going to last very long. Quality is going to go down over time. Consumption also includes services. Things like a haircut or somebody cooking a meal for you at a restaurant. Getting your car repaired by a mechanic. The labor is a service. Services are intangible goods, not a physical product. So if you go eat at a restaurant, the food that's provided to you is a good. But the person cooking the food for you, they're providing a service. They're doing a task for you. In the United States, consumption ends up being about 60 to 70% of GDP, with services being oftentimes more than half of all consumption. Generally, services are produced and consumed at the same time. Durable goods, non-durable goods, these things can be produced in 1 year and then purchased in another year. Generally, services, though, are purchased and produced simultaneously. The next component of GDP in the expenditure approach is investment, or I. Investment here is not talking about financial investment. Here we're looking at final purchases of machinery, tools, and equipment that businesses are going to use in the production process. Any type of new building construction, new homes, like new family homes, individual homes, apartments, any kind of new construction is included in investment. We're also going to count changes in inventory. For this class, when we talk about inventory, we're talking about goods that are being produced that are not necessarily intended to be sold immediately. Stores often want to have extra inventory on the shelves, so when you walk in, you can see 10 different shirts hanging on the rack, even if they only expect to sell 3 shirts. There's some businessy things involved behind that, some psychology of consumers, but also it gives businesses flexibility to sell more stuff if demand suddenly increases. Research and development does count as investment if it's increasing technology or the skill level or know-how in the production process. Non-investment transactions, so transferring ownership from one party to another, would be, buying and selling of stocks and bonds, which are called paper assets. Resale of used items. So buying a house, if it is a used good, doesn't count in investment. So if I purchase a house that somebody previously owned, it's not counted in GDP today. It was counted 5 or 10 or 50 years ago when it was originally built, but only new construction or new remodeling or new things are counted in GDP. So investment is not financial investment. This is investment in physical capital, physical machinery and tools, making products for inventory, building new houses, research and development that improves technology. Changes in inventories are going to be a big factor when we look at how our economy adjusts to an aggregate equilibrium. Naturally, inventories increase and decrease over the years. If inventory increased by $10 billion from December 2012 to December 2013, it means that there was $10 billion of goods produced that year that were not sold. So inventory is going to include all the stuff that we produced that didn't get sold that particular year. If an inventory decreased, so we say inventories dropped from 2012 to 2013, it means there were more products sold than were produced during that year. So inventories are going to be a signal to our businesses that they can increase or decrease production. We'll get into a lot more detail about this when we get into our aggregate expenditures model. We can also have disinvesting. This is going to happen when the total capital stock decreases. Factories, tools, machinery, it wears out over time. And if we're not investing more resources to fix or replace those things, we can actually have a decrease in the total investment. Depreciation is when existing capital stock wears out. If you've taken any accounting classes or you do any accounting in the future, oftentimes you'll use depreciation when you're figuring out costs. For example, if a business buys a laptop, from an accounting standpoint, the full value of that does not count in the first year it was purchased. It might be depreciated over a 3-year period, meaning the value of that laptop is going to count, the cost is going to count over 3 years rather than in a single year. And then net negative investment is when capital is depreciating faster than it's being replaced. So the end of 3 years, our computer wears out and we don't replace it. This happened a lot during the Great Depression, during the 1930s. Things were not being replaced. There was not a lot of money for capital investment. And as we saw when we talked about like production possibilities, this can lead to lower economic growth in the future. We need capital. We need to be replacing it. We need to be creating new capital. The third component in GDP is government consumption, or G. This can be city, county, state, federal government. We're talking about final goods and services that the government is purchasing, not transfer payments. So Social Security, Medicare payments, financial aid, that's not what we're talking about in government consumption. We're talking about they're paying for teacher salaries, they're building roads, they're buying staplers for the president. So any kind of publicly owned capital, so buildings, schools, highways, any sort of physical capital that the government owns. It could also be research and development. So if the government is investing in developing technology and knowledge and skills, this counts in government consumption as well. The final component of GDP is net exports, or exports minus imports. Exports are going to be goods that are produced in a domestic country and sold to a foreign country. So in the United States, anything that we produce in the United States but sell elsewhere would be an export. For example, the U.S. actually exports a lot of oil. Oil that is drilled from the United States, if it's really high quality oil, might be sold at a high price to another country. They refine that oil into gasoline. We could potentially purchase it back, or it may be used somewhere else. An import is a good that's produced in a foreign country but sold in the domestic country. The avocados I bought last week came from Mexico. That's an import. It was produced in Mexico, but it was purchased in California. So net exports, we actually want to subtract the value of imports. The avocado that I purchased from Mexico doesn't count as US GDP, so we want to make sure we're subtracting that value from the total amount produced and sold. Exports, as long as we're producing it in the US, it counts as US GDP. It doesn't matter where it's sold. For some countries, imports and exports are a huge portion of their economy. In the United States, it's a much smaller amount. But some countries, it could be 40 or 50 or 80% of their total GDP, and then becomes much more important part of their economy and political process. The United States actually has negative net exports because they purchase more than they sell in the global market. So in the US, we have a larger amount of imports than we do exports. We buy more stuff from the rest of the world than they buy from us. So we're going to get a negative number for net exports. Here's a chart that's looking at which countries are net exports or net importers. The green, countries that have a green bar shows that they're a net exporter. They're selling a lot more stuff. The red bars are showing countries that are net importers. Germany up here is at the top at 296. They're selling a lot more stuff globally than they're purchasing. Japan comes in next at 195. China is at 164. And then the last one on this chart is Sweden with a net exports of 17. This is in billions of dollars. The bottom half of this chart is showing countries that have negative net exports, meaning we're buying more stuff from the rest of the world than we're selling. Brazil, negative 9.8 billion. France is kind of in the middle at 36.8 billion. The UK, 106 billion. And then the US at negative 466 billion. So we're purchasing, almost $500 billion worth of goods and services more from the rest of the country, or the rest of the world, than they're purchasing from us. And then this kind of brings us back to that circular flow model we saw earlier in the video. We looked at this portion over here where we just have stuff going between households and firms. We can make this diagram much more complex though, where we can see firms also have private investment, where money is going from the firm back to the firm. We've got government purchases, which they're purchasing things from firms, and we have firms buying and selling to the rest of the world. So you can see that our circular flow model gets a little bit more complex, but all money is still flowing back and forth between households and firms and the government and the rest of the world, but it's all part of the process. Now let's briefly look at the income approach. This should approximately equal the same value we get when we're measuring GDP through the expenditure approach. It might be slightly different depending on how the timing of payments works in these markets compared to the timing of the value of production in goods and services. There may be some differences in how payments transfer between the government and firms or in international markets, but generally these values will be the same. The income approach measures total production by payments to the owners in the factor markets. So anyone who's being paid for labor or land, capital or entrepreneurship, all of these payments are counted in the income approach. This could be compensation of employees. So payment to office workers, payments to CEOs, payments to a restaurant cook. Rent. This is going to go to people who own land or other sort of natural resources. Interest and dividends. This is payments made on potentially financial investments. Proprietor's income. So money that's earned by business owners. Corporate profits also count in the income approach. So anytime people are earning money, it's going to count in this income approach. Taxes also count in the income approach because taxes become the revenue of the government or the income of the government. So the income approach should equal the GDP calculated by the expenditure approach. There's going to be some statistical discrepancy, but generally they should be similar numbers. Also, the income approach often ignores the consumption of fixed capital or depreciation. We will mention the income approach during different times this semester, but mainly we'll be measuring GDP through the expenditure approach. And partly that's because it lines up better with our models for aggregate expenditures and aggregate supply and demand. But whether or not you do income or expenditure approach, they should be similar values. There's a few other national accounts also that we will be mentioning and that will become important during some of our discussions. Net domestic product is GDP minus depreciation. So here we're just counting the value of things produced and we're ignoring depreciation. National income, all domestic and foreign income earned. So not just income earned on domestic production, but income earned on foreign production as well. Personal income, that refers to all income received. So domestic payments, foreign payments, any sort of transfer payments from the government. And then disposable income. This is what we actually care about as individuals. How much money do we actually have to spend on stuff? This is where you take your personal income and you subtract any taxes that you have to pay. Disposable income is the amount of money that people actually have to use to buy goods and services. So all money that's used to purchase goods and services is then paid back to households through the income approach. So whether you're a business owner or you're an employee, you're getting money from the government through transfer payments, all of that is income that is then used to purchase goods and services. So the income approach and the expenditure approach should be approximately equal. This will end our first video looking at GDP.